Hello my friends, my name is Simon Zach. I practice criminal defense law in Alberta, Canada. And in this episode, I'm going to talk about police interrogations and the right to remain silent. The following video does not constitute legal advice. I'm not your lawyer. This video does not create a lawyer relationship between us. But as always, do consult with a lawyer. Police are allowed to interrogate individuals in Canada. If they suspect an individual is involved in criminal activity, they can invite that person to voluntarily attend a police questioning session. Or if the police have reasonable and probable grounds to believe that individual has been involved in criminal activity, they could first arrest them and then bring them in for involuntary questioning, also called interrogation. Police can interrogate people for many hours. It could be 3 hours, 8 hours, or possibly 24 hours would be even very typical. Police are allowed to lie to people during interrogations as long as those lies would not shock the community. Very typical examples are lies about having evidence already against the individual. A very typical lie would be that this is your opportunity to tell your side of the story. Now, this lie is very important because the police interrogation is not really a great opportunity to tell your side of the story. Any exculpatory statements that an individual makes during a police interrogation is very unlikely to come before a court of law. A judge wouldn't even listen to that kind of evidence because it's so bad. If a person says, I wasn't there, I didn't do it, I don't know what you're talking about, I don't even know why I'm here, I'm totally innocent. Those are probably all lies if coming out of a police interrogation situation. A judge wouldn't even want to waste his time listening to that kind of evidence, right? So any exculpatory statements a person makes during an interrogation is probably not true. However, if a person makes any inculpatory statements, or statements that tend to prove that they're guilty of the facts underlying a criminal offense, a court may be very interested in those. So basically, only bad things can come out of a police interrogation. So for this reason, because police are allowed to interrogate people and allowed to lie with these kind of examples, what are your rights? So whether you're innocent or guilty, for all people, what are your rights during an interrogation? Okay, well, you have a right to counsel. Maybe you can call them for 5 minutes on the telephone and they'll explain some of your legal rights to you. You don't have a right to have a lawyer to be present with you during the interrogation. Unfortunately, you have to be interrogated alone. But you do have a right to remain silent. This comes from two sources. The first and really meaningful source is common law rule against confessions, which essentially says that any confessions you make, that the Crown must prove that any confessions you make during a police interrogation are voluntary. In other words, the Crown has to prove that there is no torture involved, there is no police activity that undermines your human dignity, illegal conduct, or actions that systematically break down your operating mind. So that essentially any confessions you make during an interrogation must be truly voluntary. And the Crown has to prove that, otherwise the confession or admission, inculpatory admission, should be thrown out. And that is, unfortunately, the courts have had to take judicial notice of the fact that such police conduct is common enough that it's probably happening. Okay, in other words, police are probably taking people to the side room, beating them for a few minutes, deleting the video evidence, or turning off the audio for the screams in the background, or whatever. Okay, that's the bad news. The good news is that you do have a right to remain silent, and that is a protected right. Means that the fact that you remain silent during an interrogation would never even come out in a court of law. It's very unlikely that a judge would even hear that you chose to exercise your right to remain silent. They would simply have evidence that there would be no evidence there at all. So you have a right to remain silent, and that right is protected. Okay. So again, as I'm saying, you have the common law right, and that right basically comes from the idea that people living in Canada can do whatever they want. You can do whatever you want. You can, as long as there's no law about it, you can talk to anybody you want or not talk to anybody you don't want to, including police officer. So if you're even if you're being interrogated, even if you're under arrest, you don't have to talk to whoever you don't want to. You can simply close your mouth, stop moving your tongue, and be quiet. That's your right. And now, how impactful is that right? It's massive. It's hard to imagine people who are not lawyers, unless you're involved in criminal law, and you really see this a lot. Reading the transcripts of police interrogations, and just seeing, here's a case. The person there's pretty much the police are just looking. They're investigating, a crime, and then boom. They ask a person and the individual just admits everything. They just say, oh yeah, I do this, I did that, and, whatever. It's just admitting the whole thing. And you kind of wonder why did they admit that? Well, they were being interrogated, and so it's understandable, but the person has a right to simply not talk to the police officers if they don't want to. Now, you might want to talk to a police officer. I don't know why you would want to talk to a police officer, because like I said, only the bad things would ever come out. Only the inculpatory statements would come before court, and none of the exculpatory statements. You could never, cross-examine a police officer and say, didn't I tell you that, I wasn't even there? Like, no, none of those good stuff is going to come out of a police interrogation. Your opportunity to tell your side of the story would come later, after you receive all the Crown's evidence of all the evidence against you. You're going to have your opportunity to tell your side of the story later, like after the interrogation, right? So that's the common law right to silence. It's because you can do whatever you want unless there's an obligation. Like, there is an obligation if a police asks you who you are. You do have to tell them your identity. You don't necessarily have to help them verify your identity, but if you don't tell them who you are, they can charge you with public mischief, right? So you do have to make a statement to the police officer if you get in a vehicle collision that causes a certain number of dollars of damage, right? But generally, you don't have to talk to a police officer. So that's the thing, that the Crown must prove any confessions or admissions of guilt are voluntary. Charter of Rights and Freedoms is the second source of the right to remain silent. Unfortunately, this right does not really have any really meaningful impact on police interrogations. The example is the Queen and Singh, S-I-N-G-H, 2007 Supreme Court of Canada decision number 48. The story in Singh is that 3 individuals walked into a pub, got in a dispute with the pub staff. They brought it outside. One of the individuals pulled out a gun and discharged the gun and shot a passerby who was walking through the front door of the pub. The passerby was killed. So witnesses said, one witness said, it was that guy who was wearing a baseball cap backwards. He's the guy who shot the gun. I know it. And another individual later told the police that the guy who shot the individual, it was the same guy I saw at another pub the following day. So police arrested Mr. Singh, and Mr. Singh called his lawyer. The lawyer said, don't say anything. You have a right to remain silent. And so Mr. Singh tells the police officers no less than 19 times, I have nothing to say. My lawyer told me that I have a right to remain silent. I'm going to exercise that right to remain silent. Bring me back to my cell, and so on. Police officers continue to interrogate him. Oh, no means yes. You do want to talk to us. And, any lawyer would say that, that's nothing. And they continue to interrogate him like that and ignore his invocation of his right to remain silent. Eventually, the police got Mr. Singh talking about his religion, talking about his health history. And they showed him video footage from the pub, and Mr. Singh identified himself as the individual who was wearing the baseball cap backwards, and as the same individual in another pub the following day. That's me. So those admissions were very instrumental in Mr. Singh's conviction for second-degree murder. And Mr. Singh argued, he said, no, I didn't mean to say anything. That's not what it was. I have a right to remain silent. I invoked my right to remain silent. And the court said, sorry, Mr. Singh, your charter right to remain silent doesn't really add anything. Here's your right. You have a right to remain silent. You can close your mouth, stop your tongue from moving, and be silent during the interrogation. That's your right. There's no evidence that the police tortured you, that they destroyed your operating mind. Your confessions were voluntary. So he was held guilty even at the appeal levels. So that's all, my friends. I think that's, again, if you want to speak to a police officer and tell them that you're guilty, like I said, during an interrogation, only the negative side would ever come before a judge. I think it's a little more efficient if you want to take civic responsibility for guilt. For example, if you commit a crime and you want to admit that you committed the crime, I think it's more efficient, in my view, to tell a judge that, Your Honor, or my Lord, or my Lady, as you see, there's very little or no evidence against me because I remained silent during the police interrogation. There's little or no evidence against me, but I want to admit to you that I committed this crime. A judge may look on that favorably and offer you some clemency, right? Perhaps. However, if you feel guilty, you may want to speak to a priest. Confess your guilt to a priest in a safe environment. You may want to speak to another religious leader. You may want to speak to a lawyer. If you want, you can talk to a police officer. Like I said, personally, I don't advise it. I've never seen anything good come of it. But you have that choice as a Canadian. You can do that if you want. So that's all, my friends. Keep well, and I'll talk to you soon.